As you work your way through Chapter 4, one of the points I really want to stress in both Chapters 3 and 4, as we've looked at the demand curve and the supply curve, is an important distinction that we make, and it was mentioned in the lectures in the demand curve, but I really want to reemphasize it here now that you've done both curves. And that's the distinction between, and we'll start with the example on the demand curve side, the distinction between quantity demanded and demand. And those two phrases, those two terms mean different things, and it's important when we're talking about economic activity that we use the right one, that we talk about when we mean quantity demanded, we use that word. When we mean demand, we use the word demand. So let's remember for a second, in sort of understanding these two terms, let's remember how we constructed the demand curve and the supply curve. And almost everything I'm saying about the demand curve holds for the supply curve too. I'll kind of come back to that at the end of this little lecture. So when we constructed the demand curve, what did we say? We held a whole bunch of things constant. We locked them up in a box and put them away. And all we wanted to know was, how will people's behavior change? How many units of this good will they buy? How will that change if we change the price? That's what we asked. That's all we wanted to know. The only thing that we were allowing to change was the price. We were holding everything else in the world constant. Again, locking it up in this box, putting it in the corner. We're not going to touch any of that stuff. All we want to know is, if we change the price, how much more or less of the good will you buy? And that's how we constructed that demand curve. And remember the downward sloping demand curve and all that, right? What that demand curve represents is, holding everything else constant, how many units of the good will people buy at various prices. So if we say the price of some good changes, let's say with apples, right? If the price of apples changes, right, we move along that curve, right? That's what we're doing, is we're moving along that curve. So if the price of apples changes, say if the price of apples falls, the quantity demanded of apples will rise. Lower price of apples, people want to buy more apples. What do we say? We say the quantity demanded of apples will rise. We don't say the demand for apples changes, or in this case increases. The demand for apples refers to that entire curve, right? All of the things that go into that, right? So when we talk about the demand for apples, we're going to, in a minute, sort of let all that other stuff out of the box. So if all that changes is the price of a good, the resulting change in people's buying or selling habits is a change in the quantity demanded or the quantity supplied. Okay, so say again, same with the supply curve. If you increase the price of that good, people will want to supply more of it. The quantity supplied will go up. What we don't say there is that supply goes up. Supply hasn't changed. The curve is still the same. Remember, demand and supply refer to that whole relationship, the whole curve that we're talking about here. Right? So again, back if we think in terms of demand, then again, demand is that whole relationship. If one of those things we've locked in the box, if we open up that box and let those things out, right, and all those factors we talked about that can shift the demand curve, changes in taste and preferences, changes in income, changes in the price of a substitute or a complement, right? There was that list of, I think, 6 things, right, we talked about in Chapter 3. Once we allow those into play, once we open that box and allow all of those things to change, then we can talk about a shift or a change, an increase or decrease in demand. If people suddenly think apples cure certain diseases and they want to buy more apples, that will be an increase in the demand for apples, right? Because it's something other than price has changed. And now we're not moving along that same curve, right? We're not just moving up and down a demand curve. What we're doing is changing the whole relationship between price and quantity, shifting that entire curve. And all of those things that we did in Chapter 3 and now here in Chapter 4, where we start to shift demand and supply curves around, they move because something other than price, all that stuff we locked away to construct the curve that we're now letting out, when those things change, the entire entire relationship changes. And that's what we mean by a change in demand. So again, with demand, taste and preferences, income, changes in prices of complements or substitutes, right? All of those things affect the entire relationship, right? Now it's not just price anymore. We're letting all those other things change. So with a concrete example here, if someone says the price of apples fell, right? So what happens to people's buying behavior. Price of apples falls, the quantity demanded of apples goes up. And we want to use that phrase, the quantity demanded. It's just a change in price. It's just a movement along that demand curve, right? So it's a change in the quantity demanded, in the number of apples people want to buy because the price has changed, right? If instead, say, the price of oranges goes up, which we'll assume is a substitute for apples. If the price of oranges goes up, people are buying fewer oranges, now they want to buy more apples. That's an increase in demand because something other than the price of apples has changed. We've let one of those other factors out of the box, in this case, the price of a substitute good, right? So anything but the price of the good itself changes, right? Then we're talking a shift in the entire demand or supply curve. And we want to use the word demand or use the word supply there, right? So, for example, thinking about Chapter 4 in supply, if we put a tax on a good, that's going to cause a change in the supply of the good, right? If simply just the price of the good goes up, if the price of apples goes up, people are going to want to offer more apples for sale. That's an increase in the quantity supplied. It's just the price of apples. But anything else, tax, subsidy, goods that use them as input, other goods that use them as inputs, right? All the things that we talked about in Chapter 4, all those other factors, that's a shift in the entire supply relationship, the entire supply schedule, the entire supply curve. Again, the key here is when it's a change only in the price of the good itself, it's a change in the quantity demanded or the quantity supplied. When it's any of those factors, any of those things, the 6 for demand and the 5 for supply that we said, right, we're in the box that we locked away and held constant. If one of those changes, it's a change in demand, okay, or supply. This language matters, right? It matters how we use this because those are, again, they're two different things and they describe two different phenomena. What we're going to see in chapters 5 and 6 is something like the following. Because one question you might ask, all right, well, we start by saying, suppose the price of apples falls, right? And we say price of apples falls, quantity demanded for apples rise, right? Okay, great. But why is the price falling, right? We're just hypothesizing it. In fact, what we're going to see in chapters 5 and 6 is that the reason price changes in the first place is because something on the other side of the market has changed. So, for example, if the supply of apples goes up, if there's more apples, okay, the price of apples falls, and the quantity demanded of apples increases, right? Follow that? So, increase in supply pushes down the price of apples. As the price of apples fall, from the demander's perspective, all that's happened is apples are cheaper, we'll buy more. So it's a movement along that demand curve, an increase in quantity demanded. And we can show this visually here. My trusty little whiteboard, right? So imagine this is the market for apples, okay? We increase the supply of apples. Suppose people decide to, it becomes cheaper, say, to grow apples. People decide to grow more apples. As a result of that, that supply curve shifts to the right. Notice that the price begins to fall. And notice, right, that we're moving along the demand curve here, right? We're moving along the demand curve down to the right. It's hard to do on the camera, right? And as we move down the demand curve, it's the quantity demanded that changes, right? So an increase in supply pushes down the price, and that increases the quantity demanded. The first is a movement of the entire curve. That causes the price to change. And from the perspective of apple buyers, all that's changed is that apples are cheaper, so they're going to want to buy more, an increase in quantity demanded. Okay? And you could work through other examples like this, right, where the demand curve changes. That's going to change the price, and that'll change the quantity supplied. If suddenly people have a shift in their taste and preferences for apples, we think they cure diseases, right? People want to buy more apples. Demand will shift to the right. Price will go up from the perspective of apple sellers. All they see is the increase in their price. They will increase their quantity supplied. Okay? And it's really, really important to keep this language straight because there's a difference, right? If demand shifts, it's because one of these things other than price, right? But if it's just price that changes, it's a change in quantity demanded or quantity supplied. And again, everything that's, I've used demand as my example here for the most part, but everything that's true of demand is also pretty much true of supply. Keeping this language straight is really important. One of the drawbacks of teaching online is that we don't have a classroom in which I can constantly sort of put examples on the board and ask you questions and make sure that you guys are using the right language, the right terminology to describe this. But In the absence of that, right, you might think about some of the, especially after the first exam, as we get into chapters 5 and 6, there will be some practice questions and things there, and you really want to be thinking about it. For now, really understanding that when we construct a demand curve or a supply curve, we hold all that other stuff constant. We lock it away in a box and say none of that's changing. All we're looking at here is a change in price. And so if it's just a change in price on that side of the market, it's a change in quantity demanded or quantity supplied. If one of those other things changes, a change in tastes and preferences or income or substitute complement, right, any of those things change, then it's a shift in the entire curve. It's a change in demand. Keeping this terminology straight is really, really important. You can, by the way, expect on this exam, on the exam that's coming up in 10 days or so, to see that language right there, and that you're expected to know, to understand that difference. So if you're not clear about this stuff, again, please feel free to ask in the Q&A, in the general Q&A forum, or drop me an email, because this stuff is really important and it matters, again, for how we make sure for how we understand how markets work.